Welcome to lecture number 9.
As discussed in last week, during the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, about 800,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, towns, and villages, and most of these places were destroyed. Palestinians in this process became refugees. Most of the refugees found themselves in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also in some of the neighboring Arab states. Today, when we count together those who are still alive and their descendants of the refugees, the original Palestinian refugees, so the United Nations recognizes about 5 million of these people as refugees. Another important point that needs to be made is that during the Nakba, a minority of the Palestinians within what became the State of Israel were not expelled. I'm talking about 156,000 Palestinians who remain in their towns and villages. These people found themselves in a state that didn't want them, and they themselves didn't want to be part of that new state. Nevertheless, at some point they became citizens, but for a long time they felt shocked and defeated without their leadership, without the social, political, and cultural infrastructure that they were part of and was destroyed by Israeli forces and the Israeli state during and after the Nakba. This minority of Palestinian citizens of the State of Israel amounts nowadays to 20% of Israel's population. If you ask what happened with the land that was taken from Palestinians, the land on which towns and villages existed and were demolished, destroyed, well, on those lands, Israel mainly built Jewish settlements, but also many national parks. So today, when you tour around these national parks, in many of them, you can see still the remains of the Palestinian villages hid behind new trees and other things that are part from this national park where citizens have recreation. One more point, Palestinians and their allies commemorate the Nakba in the Nakba Day, which take place around the world on May 15, just a day after the Israeli independence. We have commemorations also here in Australia, mainly in Sydney and Melbourne. In 1949, the United Nations established the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, an institution within the United Nations that it was tasked to take care of the Palestinian refugee problem. Officially, the United Nations defined Palestinian refugees as persons whose normal place of residence was Palestine during the period of 1st of June 46 to 15th of May 48, that is a day after the Israeli independence, and who lost both home and means of livelihood as a result of the 1948 conflict.
بإيد الزلمة والمرأة. تروح اللي ما عندهاش أولاد صغار تروح مع جوزها على القطيفة، يقطفوا يحطوا الدخان، يفطروا ويبدوا يشكوا.
عندنا النسوان بتشتغل مثل الرجال وزيادة، عندنا فيش كسر، فيش متعودين انه المرأة مثل الزلمة، تروح مع جوزها، عندها ولد صغير، في عندها حدا يقعد عنده، بتروح فيش، بتروح بنت حماتها، بتروح حدا معاه، بس بتشتغل المرأة مثل الزلمة.
يوم فاتوا على البلد هاجموها آخر هجوم، لاقوا غير الختياريات ما كانوش أكموا حدا، هسه متخبيات بالبلد محل هيك تبان هذا بحطوا فيه تيبن للبقر بخزنه، هسه متخبي هو مع الختياريات. ولد 16 سنة ياسر علوطي اسمه، كانت دار هون عن حارة المنزول. هسه اطلعوا معهن مع النسوان، طلعوهن لما استهدوا عليهن، طلعوهن هن ماخذينه لغاد شوي طاخينه.
عاد انا عم بخبز رقيق مش مكمل الخبزات، بعد كم رغيف دشرتهم، قبضت الخبزات وفتت على البيت بطل شرشر، ما قدرتش اطوله، بوش الدخان زي الغنم ملقحة من حم الطيارة، بصعوبة فتحت الخزانة واخذت شرشر، لفيت الخبزات حتى وظلوا مع الطبق، لفيته احسن لي بس وشوفوا الوعي اللي عندي، لفيت اللي بس وحطيتهم عودة على الطبق. اختي طلعت شو مصرصعه بالحياكه، طلعت كفتة الحياكه، اللي طلع بريت البطانيه ظل بسحماتها، واللي اجى بالبطانيه اخذته معه.
يا عم احنا كنا واعيين، لما اجت الطيارات اجت على الساعه 5 ضربات، قال قمت انا اركض عجنت شويه عجن ناخذ شويه خبز معنا، واخوتي ما كانوش، الشباب كلها كانت تفل، بدي اخبز، صرت احط كل الرغيفين سوا، اطلعوا عجين، عملت شوي وانا قاعده، ابوي عم بيشرب قهوه ولا فات ابو محمود الهواري كامل يركض ويصيح، قال له ابوي ولك شو في يا ابو محمود؟ قال له بيتنا راح، تركت الخبز ولحقته، كنت هيك بعرفش كيف شو صغار، لحقته لهون ولا لقيته صار يمرض. كان له اخت كانت بصف اسمها فوزيه، ولا حدا طلعوها ميتة بس شعر اشقر هيك وما كانتش محروقه، بس لما طلعوا مرت كامل وابنه كانوا محروقين. مات كتير فيها هون حوالي 18، كان من صفد كمان لاجئين قريبا. في بنت كان عمرها 13 سنة نطت من الشباك هيك بطنها طالع عليك من الشباك.
عاد بدهم يطلعونا، صاروا يطخوا، نحن اخر اشي طلعنا على الارض، قعدنا برا وشتاء بتشارين، شو شتاء عنا، شتاء ما بدناش نطلع، ما بدنا نطلع. اجوا الجيش صفونا، انا بحكي عن بيت اهلي يعني، صفونا كلياتنا هيك وبدهم يرجعون، صرخت لهم امي، قالت لكم دخلكم، نحن بنطلع بنقعد بالشتاء برا وما تقتلوليش الاولاد.
اخوي كانوا الشباب يخافوا، راحوا اخوي اللي اصغر على لبنان، راحت خالتي باول قبل ما يعملوا الاسايم جبتهم اجت، واجوا على البيت وعملوا لهم تحقيق وقالوا لهم احنا خفنا وفلينا من القتل.
خالتك طلعت خصوصي على لبنان؟
كان يطلع النسوان، مين يطلع فكري؟
وليش كانوا يبعثوا النسوان مش الاسلام؟
يخافوا اسلام يقتلوهم، يخافوا يقتلوهم. راحت مع ام ركات، هاي بقت ام ركات تروح على لبنان تجيب رز سكر تهريب، وبقت عايشه من وراي الشغله وعرق يا ويلي بقت مقوى.
كيف كانت البلد لما رجعتي؟ متذكري كانت فاضي؟
شو وهري، شو فاضي، عم بقول لك اول ما رجعت فتنا الطريق من هون ماشيين، وميلت على هذا البيت اشوف شو صار فيه، بعد القتلة في الارض والكلاب عم تاكل فيه، كان طفل بين ايديهم ياكلوا فيه. فاتت وراي مرت خالي، قلت له بدك اطلعي شوي تشوفي، بتقدريش يا كتير الغلبه، قالت لي الا تفوتي اطلعي. قعدت مدة أحلم فيه هذا الولد كيف كانت شكلته، ما دفنوش بقوا هي طلعت.
can see where there are Palestinian refugee camps. As you can see in the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, but also in Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon.
كم عدد السكان هون؟
30,000 بين 30 و 35,000 نسمة.
والمساحة؟
المساحة هي بتيجي بربع كيلو متر مربع.
We're in Balata refugee camp, which is the most densely populated camp in the occupied West Bank. This is also another street, he's saying. كتير ضيق. The crazy thing is you would think that a refugee camp would be a temporary type of thing, but as you're seeing, these are generations growing up here, born and raised. So his family was exiled. They became refugees from Jaffa in 1948. They came here in 1950 and they've been here ever since. إنه إشي يعني دائم مش
يعني هلا
permanent.
بإمكاننا إنه نروح نعيش برا المخيم، بس إنه ما دامنا تخلينا عن المخيم هيك إحنا تخلينا عن مبادئنا إنه حق العودة. احنا بنطمع دائما انه مش نطلع من المخيم نروح على مكان ثاني، احنا بنطمع انه نرجع على طول على يافا، على ارضنا، على مكان سيدي اللي انولد فيه، لانه انتمائنا بالنهايه بيجي لمدننا الاصليه، بيجي ليافا وحيفا وعكا واراضي 48، مش لا انه انه احنا الفلسطينيين كلنا واحد صح، بس انا ليش اطلع اعيش من مخيم بلاطه اروح استقر بمكان ثاني، وانا اذا استقريت في المكان الثاني خلص رح اصير من هذا المكان، رح اتخلى عن حقي في العوده، احنا ما بدنا نتخلى عن حقنا في العوده. اكيد يعني هذا حلمنا، احنا تربينا على هذا الشيء انه حق العوده لا بديل عنه، انه انا من يافا لازم ارجع عن يافا، اذا انا ما رجعتش يمكن ابني يرجع، يمكن حفيدي، بس المهم في حدا من سلالتنا رح يرجع، هاي هي كل الفكره.
بس يعني فاتحين بزنس من السيارة.
طبعا يعني شيء كثير.
This is like, you know, food trucks. This is like food car, selling corn with some spices. It's good. Let's go into zone. كيف يعني مشاعرك هلا انه انت ممنوع تروح على يافا وعائلتك ممنوع تروح على يافا، حتى يعني
شيء جدا سيء.
لو سألت جدك اللي هو لاجئ من يافا إنه عمرك تصورت إنه ممكن تعيش هون في مخيم لمدة أكثر من 60 سنة، شو ممكن يحكي؟
بس يعني برضه خطر ببالي هذا السؤال، إنه أنت كيف كنت يعني ما كنتش متوقع أكيد إنه بيوم وليلة يجي حدا يطلعك من أرضك يحطك في مخيم ويحكي لك يلا عيش. أنت تفكر إنه حكوا لي إنه هلا هم كانوا متأملين إنه حتى النار الطبيخ طفوا على الطبيخ وطلعوا، إنه بأمل إنهم يرجعوا يكملوا الطبخة وياكلوها. يعني أخذوا الأشياء الأساسية، مصاري وبس، أولادهم، غير هيك ما أخذوا. هيك بيوم وليلة اختفوا ومات لاجئ. يعني مأمنين إنه إحنا لازم نرجع، وإن شاء الله نرجع ورح نرجع.
Have brother look at the events that followed the Nakba and the establishment of the State of Israel, which are in fact two sides of the same coin. Now, really at a broader political scale, after World War II, the world entered a new phase, a new international system, a bipolar system, in which there were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The tensions between these two superpowers became defined as the Cold War. And basically it meant that these two countries attempted to try and gain on their side sites in regional conflicts. These happen in South America, in Asia, certainly all over Africa, but also in the Middle East, and also with our particular case of Israel, the Palestinians, and the Arab states. So very soon, already during the 1950s, what was perceived until then as a problem between Zionism and the Palestinians became defined under different terms as the Israeli-Arab conflict. This is because of the war, the conventional war that took place between Israel and the Arab states in 48-49, but also because of a series of military interventions and wars between Israel and the Arab states. So the Palestinian issue will slowly start to disappear as the most important issue on the agenda around the establishment of the State of Israel. On the day of the Declaration of Israeli Independence, both superpowers, the United States and the Soviets, recognized the State of Israel, which meant that these both countries tried to gain Israel on their side. This is going to change, particularly after the War of 1956, what is called the Suez Canal invasion by Israel, France, and Britain. After this event, the Soviet Union began shifting their position and started supporting the Arab states, particularly Egypt and Syria. We mentioned before that the Palestinian minority within Israel, those about 150,000 people who remain in their homes, was a very weakened minority because of the catastrophe that they have just experienced. But meanwhile, in the Palestinian refugee camps, people became very politicized and tried to find a way how to bring back their issue into the international sphere and how to put a fight against the State of Israel. That platform within the refugee camps created a guerrilla movement. We can say the first after the 1930s Izzadin al-Qassam guerrilla. The movement that emerged in the refugee camps was called as the Fedayeen. The Fedayeen used to send militia groups into Israel to strike military and civilian targets. So it was mainly about infiltrations into Israel and try to get back into their refugee camps. With time, these efforts became more systematic, and eventually in 54, one of the most important political parties, or would say broad Palestinian organizations, will emerge. This is the Fatah that exists until nowadays, and it's still the strongest political faction within the Palestinian society. Palestinian resistance became more and more organized during early 60s, and in 64 the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded. This is still the major umbrella of the Palestinians, the national organization that concentrates all the efforts in the Palestinian struggle. The PLO was at the beginning chaired and controlled by people who were still part of what we call once the notables, the rich families, the traditional families, particularly from Jerusalem. But very soon, younger forces, people coming from a middle class, people from the refugee camps will join the PLO through a number of different political parties. The Fatah itself joined the PLO in 67, and very soon Yasser Arafat, who was the leader, the chairman of the PLO until his death, gained the leadership of the PLO, and that happened in 69. Now, apart from Fatah, which is mainly a national, secular, liberal political faction, there were more leftist, and there are more leftist factions within the PLO, as the Popular Front, the Popular Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and another one which was led back then by Ahmed Jibril. Now, today, one of the main forces in the Palestinian camp is indeed Hamas, that controls some of the internal sides of the life in Gaza, and we will talk about Hamas as particularly next week and the last week. The PLO start forming itself as a very broad institution that included a number of tasks and functions. It had militias, that is part of its forces was based on military action. It had a central administration of sort of government, also a parliament that still is functioning, trade unions, and other professional organization. And it even established a Red Crescent Society. I said the PLO is the most important and broader Palestinian organization, though nowadays, if we talk about 2020, the PLO finds itself not with many ideas in regards of how to struggle against the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and how to press home to make the Palestinian refugee problem more important on the international sphere. As mentioned before, the first military encounter between Israel and Arab states after 48 was the Suez Canal campaign, when Israel, France, and Britain invaded Egypt, conquered Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, and eventually have to withdraw. Since those days, Israel continued to militarize itself, including building of nuclear capability, on which was aided by France. The next military encounter between Israel and the Arab states took place on June 67 during a war that lasted just 6 days. In this campaign, Israel conquered again the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the whole of the West Bank, and the Golan Heights from Syria, as you can see here in the map. That more than tripled Israel's regional size, and in fact brought Israel to control what was called before mandatory Palestine. That is, the whole of the territory from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, plus the Sinai Peninsula that was conquered from Egypt. That is, since 67, Israel took control of all those territories. In 79, Israel and Egypt signed a peace accord, the famous Camp David peace agreement, and Israel returned to Egypt the Sinai Peninsula. In contrast, in 1981, Israel annexed the Golan Heights, and from Israel's point of view, the Golan Heights belong to Israel, not from the international law perspective. We need to add that the current government in Israel is planning for this year to annex parts of the West Bank. So we need to see what happened with these. When Israel occupied the West Bank and Gaza, they were living there about 1 million Palestinians. Today, as we mentioned before, there are 5 million Palestinians between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. The first Israeli actions once West Bank and Gaza were occupied were again massive expulsions, similarly to what happened during the Nakba. Israel applied military rule to Gaza and the West Bank. The West Bank is still ruled under military occupation, and Israel adopted policies of destruction of houses, expulsion, arbitrary arrest, land expropriation, and a wide range of measures to repress Palestinian resistance. We will discuss this later, but in 2005, Israel withdrew its settlements from the Gaza Strip, and since 2007, the Gaza Strip is being besieged by Israel and also Egypt. Now, since the Six-Day War, Israel launched a policy of settlement in the occupied territories, in the occupied Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza. And what we are going to do in the next slide is to have a look at what the international law says in relation to what is permitted and what is not permitted in occupied military territories. Fourth Geneva Convention from 1949 defines quite clearly what an occupying power should do and should not do when it occupies a territory, particularly when populations live in those territories. So to begin with, the convention clearly states that the occupying power should provide for the inhabitants of the occupied territory. That is, the occupying power should be responsible for the peoples that have occupied. In addition, it's worth looking at Article 49 of the Convention, sub-article 1 and 6. Let us read them both. So Article 49.1 states, individual or mass forcible transfers as well as deportation of protected persons from occupied territory to the territory of the occupying power or to that of any other country, occupied or not, are prohibited regardless of their motive. So this means that the deportations that Israel forced on Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza at the end of the '67 war were prohibited by international law. In addition, Article 49.6 states, the occupying power shall not deport or transfer parts of its own civilian population into the territory it occupies. That is to say, settlement into the occupied territories are prohibited. We know that Israel have been settling the West Bank and Gaza since '67 with its own population. In the West Bank, there are about 500,000 Israeli settlers living in settlements all over the West Bank. In Gaza, there were Israeli settlements, but as I mentioned before, these were evacuated in 2005, and 2 years after Israel launched a siege on Gaza. Now, what is the response of Israel to these allegations? Israel claims that the 4 Geneva Convention simply does not apply to the territories in question, that is, mainly to the West Bank and also to the Golan Heights, by the way, where Israel not only annexed them, but have been establishing settlement since 67. Why Israel claims that the 4 Geneva Convention does not apply? Because Israel believes that these are not occupied territories, in the sense that Israel, as a Jewish state, sees itself as in eternal ownership of this land. And in 67, the Jewish people have come back to these territories. So they were not occupied. Therefore, Israel sees these territories as disputed territories. That is, they are under dispute between two sides, Israel and the Palestinians, but they are not occupied in the classical sense from Israel's point of view. By the way, the Australian government have adopted this perspective, this Israeli perspective, and if you pay attention when Australian officials speak about the conflict, they do not use occupied territories, but they use the notion of disputed territories. Notwithstanding Israel's response to the allegations based on 4th Geneva Convention, as the United Nations General Assembly have adopted many resolutions against the existence of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, also in East Jerusalem that was conquered in 67, and the Golan Heights. The United Nations sees this settlement as a violation of international law, and also in the United Nations Security Council there are resolutions that demand from Israel the evacuation of these settlements. Let us think what the occupation of 1967 means, both at the more practical and conceptual level. So, as said, since the war in 67, Israel became de facto the governing state entity, ruling the whole of the area of historical mandatory Palestine, that is the territory that was controlled by the British Mandate from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, and it is ruling all of the people living in this area, both Jews and Palestinians. Now, if we look at this diagram here, we perhaps can understand better what this means. So, for instance, we discussed at the beginning of the semester that Israel had elections. So the question is, these officials that are elected in Israeli elections to the Israeli institutions, that is, to the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, the Israeli government, and so on and so forth. What these people, these elected and appointed officials, ruled over? Well, we need to distinguish here between the two sort of regimes that Israel institutions rule over, both integrated in one political system, that is, the governing institutions of the State of Israel. On the one hand, these institutions rule over what can be called Israel proper, that is, the Israel of the 1949 armistice lines, or if you like, the Israel before 1967 war. In this territory, there is a majority of Jewish citizens, about 80%, and a minority of Palestinian citizens, about 20%. Palestinian citizens, as we will be discussing next week, suffer discrimination of all types, whereas Jewish citizens are privileged in the sense that they do enjoy full rights, and also their state is defined as a Jewish state that should benefit its Jewish citizens. In addition, Israel's state institutions rule also what is called in the literature and journalists writing the OPT, the Occupied Palestinian Territories. These include the military occupation of the West Bank and also the siege of Gaza Strip since 2007. In the OPT, you also have two types of population. You have the occupied Palestinians living in those territories who are ruled by military rule, and we have also the Israeli settlements with its Israeli citizens living in the West Bank, to whom not military rule is applied, but the same civil law that is applied to Israelis within Israel proper. Many have defined this separation of law and population as apartheid. Now, altogether, some scholars have called this situation as the one-state condition. So this is not a one state in the sense of one democratic state for all of its citizens, Jews and Palestinians, but rather a one state ruling from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea into regimes, one in which some form of democracy takes place to the benefit of its Jewish citizens and to the detriment of its Palestinian citizens, and another regime where military rule is applied to the occupied Palestinians, whereas civil law is applied to the Israeli settlers. It's the reality of people living under military occupation. That is a very complex question that needs quite a lot of detail. You have here a partial list of practices that the State of Israel uses to control the Palestinian population in the West Bank. In the next couple of slides, you also have a couple of very short videos illustrating the reality of Palestinians living under occupation. But I do invite you to Google and try to find more information and more illustrations about what it means to live under military occupation. So for instance, to move from one town to another, you, as a Palestinian living in under occupation, you will probably pass through checkpoints controlled by Israeli soldiers. Palestinians need special permits if they ask to work within Israel. There is a vast network of surveillance watching over Palestinian activities. Palestinian land is regularly confiscated by Israel to build new Israeli settlements or for IDF camps. As we explained before, there are different systems of law being applied to Palestinians living in the West Bank and to Jewish Israelis living also in the West Bank in their Israeli settlements. There is also segregation in terms of transportation and use of roads. And Israel has been building during the last decade or so a separation wall in which you'll have more detail in the next slide. So it's really hard to put all this together and have comprehensive understanding of what it means to live under military occupation. But this is the reality, the everyday reality of Palestinians living in the West Bank. On the Palestinian population living in these territories, a military regime was imposed. In this regime, it had and still has various dimensions. One of them is that Palestinian workers ever since have been exploited as cheap labor in the Israeli economy. Until these days, thousands of Palestinians from the West Bank come to Israel for work. This is not the case anymore with Gazan Palestinians because of the siege and blockade imposed on Gaza since 2007. But in addition to the fact that the military regime on the West Bank and Gaza in the Gaza Strip was also occupied during the Six-Day War in 1967, and from that year Israel slowly began establishing settlements within the Strip. Now in 2005, pretty much as a reaction to years of Palestinian resistance to Israeli occupation, the government of Israel decided to withdraw its settlements from the Gaza Strip and also the military camps in the Strip. Couple of years after, Israel imposed a blockade and a siege in collaboration with Egypt on the Gaza Strip. And today, almost 2 million Palestinians are being controlled from the outside of the Strip. Israel has total airspace control and sea control, and all movement of people and goods into Gaza and out of Gaza are controlled by Israel. The same goes for energy, water and electricity that come from the Israeli side are being restricted by the Israeli government.